presentation. So we're going to go to the next session, next portion of this morning session. If we could please invite Lishan, Anson, Greg, Jorg, and Murali to the front stage. We have a nice, comfortable chair for you.
Not starting to sleep, actually. Maybe, Vinod, you introduce the session a bit, because it's something new even for us. The 5 invited panelists were asking, do we need some slides or not? And the intention was not to have slides, to start just a discussion. And Vinod, do you want to talk about
absolutely. And so we thought that as we put the program together, this would be... Okay, great. Okay. So maybe we'll start off. We were going to start off with Murali Padala, but he's going to get mic'd up. So we'll wait and go straight to Lishan since you're mic'd up. So Lishan, you're a very unique individual in a lot of ways. But tell us a little bit about how you were able to, as a very heavy clinical practicing cardiac surgeon, with great results and doing a lot of heart surgery, having transitioned into where you are now. And what would be nice to know is some of the pitfalls that you dealt with moving from clinical practice to an idea, to forming a company, to consequently running a company. So, in the next 4 or 5 minutes, just give us an overview of what maybe it would be suggestions for you, for the people in the audience.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Well, you can show the slides.
Well, if you have slides, hell, that's even better. You want to do that? Right. Yeah, do that. That'd be great. Great.
Hopefully most of those questions will at least get touched upon. Thanks, Vino, thanks, Tommy, and thanks, Francis, for the invitation. I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about our model and our experience with medical device innovation with my group, Pavilion Holdings Group, over the past 6 years or so. This thing not advancing.
Can you guys advance the slides for him, please? Thanks.
So, I think philosophically, because I think part of what we're talking about here is how to think about medical device innovation. We hear the term translational medicine. We hear the term, it's almost a cliche now, of bench to bedside. And I think what's different about medical devices is that the way we look at it is really bedside to bedside. So, these are individual clinicians. Everybody in this room, in their clinical practice, will see an unmet clinical need and will come up with creative ideas as to how to come up with a solution to that, and then bring it back to clinical practice. That's in stark contrast to to pharma or biologics, where no one's walking down the hall thinking, wow, it'd be great if I had a drug for this gene target, right? So that's really step one, is to think about unmet clinical needs and think about simple, creative solutions for that. Unlike pharma and unlike drugs, we have the advantage of the infrastructure and the capital that's required to get these things moving forward are really not as great as we might think. There are obstacles to innovation, but they're not as great as we might think. It's $1 billion to get a drug to market. We can get devices to market for several $1 million and more limited resources. Next slide, please.
That's still a lot of money, Lishan, $7 million.
So, I think, and this has really become a pet issue for me, is I think we have limited our pool of intellectual capital. If you take kind of the entire universe of clinicians and say, most everybody, as I said, have good clinical ideas. Why is it that such a small number end up actually moving forward with that and ultimately getting to the device? And there's a whole lot of reasons. They don't have time. We don't know even where to start. Some people just still don't have an interest in being an entrepreneur. They don't have money, or they've spent their entire 401k trying to move something along until their spouse cut them off. A variety of reasons. And even with successful companies, founders often get screwed and they end up with nothing to show for it at the end of the day. Next slide. The other problem, which is becoming an acute problem, is limited access to capital. I won't go into a lot of issues here, but really the venture capital model, which is what has fed the ecosystem for many years, is broken. Venture capitalists are not investing in small startups. They've become these huge funds. In order to move the needle, they have to allocate big chunks of capital. There's sort of a herd mentality when it comes to that.
So, Lishan, hold on for a second. Tommy had a good point. Go ahead and
I just felt maybe we ask the audience for a second. Those who are clinicians, and you just brought up an important point. You're clinicians, you're doing a great job, you're stuck there more or less. Theoretically, you're working or having so much work to do, but you have a good idea.
Right.
but you never bring that idea to any further course, to company, or talk to an engineer and so on. So how many of you had such an idea? Any
raise your
good
hand.
idea? Raise your hand.
Prove me right. 'Cause I bet
Raise
you
your
everybody
hand
in
that
the
you
room
had an
has.
idea that you just let drop. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to raise my hand too. Yeah, so it's 25, 30% of this room.
Yeah.
The other people are shy, so it's maybe about 50% of the room.
So not to take up too much of my time, but next slide, please. So our group came together about 6 years ago. The gentleman on the left there is Mike Glennon. Some of you may know him. He's a medical device veteran. Many of you know Brian de Guzman, who's my clinical partner. And we got together about 6 years ago. Mike came up with a model that sort of overcomes many of these obstacles with regard to getting devices through to market with very little capital in sort of record time. Next slide. And I won't go into every element of this, but we look for good products. We set up our companies virtual, and the key is to be capital and time efficient, to get things moving sort of quickly with as little money as possible. Next slide. And this is what we've done over the last 6 years. We've come up with 7 companies. One of them has exited, Vortex Medical. 3 of them are moving forward, and 3 of them are raising capital right now. Next slide. So here's a couple of just 2 quick examples, one that actually went to fruition and one that we're working on that hopefully can provide some lessons about how to do this. So when I was over down the street here at Brigham with interest in just basically getting started in my as an attending there, Dr. Goldhaber is in that picture, asked me if I'd be willing to do open embolectomies. So we did a bunch of open pulmonary embolectomies. I think we did 30 of them in a year, and really felt, okay, we had great results. We really had good things to report in circulation there, but it seemed crazy to do this big surgical procedure to just go out with a gallbladder forceps and pluck out a clot. So what I identified was the unmet clinical need is, could we come up with an endovascular device that facilitates en bloc removal of clots and other types of material without the need for open surgical extraction? Next slide. And so we came up with Vortex Medical. We came up with the AngioVac device. Many of you in the room have used this. And we moved fairly quickly with just $3.5 million all the way from through FDA clearance in about 18 months and to ultimately selling it to AngioDynamics. It's widely used now. There have been thousands of cases that have been performed, not just for pulmonary embolectomy, but really all over the venous system. Next slide. So, this is what we were doing surgically with a gallbladder forceps. This is what we were able to accomplish endovascularly with the AngioVac device, basically removing a pulmonary embolism endovascularly. Next slide. That's an animal study. This is obviously a real clinical case done up the street at Mass General, a big saddle embolus. You can see that what's extracted here really mimics what we were doing surgically before. Next slide. So one other example, which is we haven't moved forward with yet, we're raising capital for. Again, every story has every situation, every device we've worked on has a clinical story. This clinical story, many in the room may have experienced, was that we had a run where our electrophysiologist was perforating veins doing lead extractions. I think we did 3 of them in about a 6-week period. We shut them down, we made them do them in the OR, and we did all the normal things that all of us do. But we thought, what is the problem with the devices we use for lead extraction? And could we come up with a simple, disposable, non-capital device that could extract leads while minimizing the risk of perforation, or at least relative to existing technologies? Next slide. So we came up with this device, lead rail, and what we came up with was to replace the circumferential dissection with a longitudinal slitting of the fiber sheath, and then protect the venous wall by indexing the cutting element so it's always on the luminal surface using a guide wire. So it's basically a figure of 8, and the cutting element is in between. Next slide. So this is basically an example of what we've come up with. This patent has been issued. You can see the one part of the figure of 8 is tracking the pacemaker lead, one part is tracking the guide wire, and it's basically just slitting the sheath open. Next slide. Until it's completely unsheathed. Next slide. We've done some benchtop prototyping of this with a model of a fiber sheath on a lead. Next slide. And we're able to slit it open with our device with no damage to the other wall. Next slide. So really, those are 2 examples of basically taking these ideas. We still have the problem of capital, and we still have the problem of expanding the pool of capital, and those are things we're actually working on. We're going to start a company this fall called XMed, where we're actually working with some guys on Wall Street to have access to the public capital market, so you don't have to deal with the VCs. And then we're coming up with this doc sourcing platform, which will facilitate average clinicians who want to keep practicing but have good ideas that they can actually insert into a process without giving up their practice like we did, and actually participate in the successes if those are successful. So sorry if I took up,
no, that's perfect.
Up too much.
Lisa, we're going to come back to you. So that really starts us off really nice. What I have too big of a clinical practice to be able to do things a lot myself in the lab. So at Emory, what we've done is the Apica device that you've heard of. We actually partnered with Georgia Tech. And at Emory, what we also did is we hired Murali Padala, who's now assistant professor of surgery, and he's an engineer that I was lucky to be on his thesis committee while he was at Tech, and that's how we met. And so this is the way that we've been able to do stuff from our end, from clinicians to engineers. And I thought it'd be really important, we thought it'd be really important for Murali to say, if I come up to him or he comes up with an idea, and we hand it to him on a piece of paper and say, Murali, here's an idea for a new product, what would an engineer do with it first? And we thought it'd be important for an engineer to tell you what his next steps would be. So Murali, thank you for coming.
Thanks, Vinod.
Yep.
As Vinod just mentioned, at Emory University, we took a different path, which is have a research laboratory where we could actually get the ideas from concept to prototype and testing. And the first step as an engineer or anyone should be is you have an idea, great, but does it really work? And I think that part is largely lost or missed in several occasions, because there may be 10 ideas, but probably one will work. And to understand systematically at the beginning stages whether it would work or not, whether it is on benchtop models or very simple models, would be important. And at Emory, what we have done is a 3-stage process within my laboratory. We begin with ideation, where we are trying to just test them in explanted hearts or any sort of very simple concepts. Then move it to prototyping stage. And what we have done at Emory is, with 3D printing becoming so big now, we have an in-house 3D printer. We can print a prototype within no time. And that helps us to actually test and do this in an iterative process. And then we also have a large animal laboratory. So what we are doing is, instead of taking an idea all the way, whenever we have an idea, take it to venture capital, we are actually delaying that process as much as possible and keeping it and incubating it within the research laboratory. And we are raising funding by using these devices to actually study the physiology of the problem using NIH grants. And what that allows us to do is, for example, we have a mitral device now that we are working towards developing for clinical use. We are using that to understand how does timely correction of mitral repair impact the ventricular remodeling process. So that is a basic science project, but still you can use devices as the vehicle to understand that and seek federal government funding as well. So that is the model we have done so far.
But I think that it's going to be important, Murali, if somebody from this audience came up to an engineer, there's 2 different pathways. You can go through the university, which is a little bit difficult to do, but you can also hire an engineer and say, build me this. And then talk a little bit about like CAD drawings and things like that. I mean, you have, what is an engineer, when he gets a product, what is he going to do with it? He's going to first build a prototype, or he's going to do a CAD drawing? Just explain that process a little bit.
Yes, so CAD is simply computer-aided design, so anything that needs to be prototyped first has to be put from paper into computer-aided design softwares, and then you send those models for prototyping, or you prototype them yourself using 3D printing. So the first step would be to look at the basic design concept and figure out design features that would be very important, that would make the device unique and different from everything else. Once you have that, you make a computer-aided design or prototype, which is nothing but a virtual prototype, and then you can actually do some testing virtually whether the prototype will work or not, following which you make a prototype and actually test it in relevant animal models, or even just benchtop models.
And obviously you have to do your IP testing also. You have to make sure that the IP that you're going to put in is not, you have to do your search. You just comment on that, and we want to move to other people then.
At our institution, IP comes in a little later, in the sense that instead of just protecting our ideas all the way up front without actually determining if it is unique or any different, what we have done is actually done quite a bit of testing. And after the first preclinical testing is done is when we have protected the idea. So having the ability to get it to that stage in-house without disclosing it outside helped us get to that. So when we are filing an IP, we know we are unique, we know it works. So that way, we also have a much more streamlined process towards its development.
Just to learn a bit more about how the process of clinicians and yourself as engineer goes, how often do you kind of consult each other? Is it like daily or weekly, or do you have conferences fixed? If the clinician comes to you with a new idea, any example, for example, a closure device, build me some device to close the apex, and he has some raw ideas, and then you make some design on the computer. How often do you consult each other to develop that thoughts further?
Yes, so that largely depends upon the clinician. There are clinicians, Vinod has a very high volume practice, but every Tuesday morning, we have a 1-hour conference where we are meeting and we are talking about everything that is happening in the laboratory. And the clinicians do spend, some of them do spend more time in the lab doing some of the animal work. So we get to come up with ideas.
We've actually hired a junior attending to specifically help Morali in the needs in the research laboratory. So.
And it's not just the clinician coming to the laboratory too. I spend my time in cases when Vinod is doing cases or everyone else is. That way, there are some very simple engineering solutions which you can find. For example, a better steerable guide wire, or something that what you do in 8 or 10 steps could be reduced to 2 steps. There are simple things that I can understand too, so I do that by spending more time in the clinical side.
Is there any statistics showing, for example, that such close working relationship, weekly meetings, or even more frequent meetings lead to a fast development of a product in comparison to some engineers who work there for half a year and then
we'll tell you next year.
The clinicians say, okay, come on, this is all crap, forget about it?
Well, I don't have a statistic, but from my experience, what I can say is if you bring on a short-term engineer who just does something for you and moves on, he's, as an engineer, is just trying to implement a concept that the clinician has in their heads, whether it works or not. But if you have an actual program going on with an engineer who understands the physiology, what it gives is a two-way process where a clinician comes with the concept, but the engineer can also say, well, this doesn't make any sense, or this does make sense, how can we improve it in this way? So at least at our institution, what I've found is that type of interaction seems to work much better than the short-term hiring of an engineer.
We want to get the clinicians involved now, but go ahead, Francis. Go ahead. You have a question.
Just a question that Lishan brought up. I mean, you mentioned venture, and actually our keynote speaker has actually published work on this at Harvard Business School about the issue of venture capital. And I guess a financial discussion would be important as well, because you're right, it's dramatically changed, and the venture capital who you think may be backing you and in turn actually isn't backing you.
Okay.
Yeah. And that can put you in a real bind. Okay. But the Emory model you talked about it seems to be more of what traditionally in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s was instead of NIH funding, you got large amounts of clinical revenue, and then you put the residents in the lab and you worked on a clinical problem, you came up with something. And I think what's happened now, it seems, is now it's become more of how do you take an idea like that? And so the question I have for you is, one, you mentioned about that you apply for basic science grants and to fund a device, let's say, or to fund research on that you could use a device. But doesn't that open you up in applying for your grant? You obviously have to describe what you're doing, and then that's public. And is there an issue with IP now that this went through a committee and it's public because it's an NIH grant or an American Heart grant? So if you could just comment on that. And the second thing, have you also used the small business grants that NIH gives? And have you used that also in addition to your R01, for example, from the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and then taken that to the next step and gotten the small business grants? So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And then the IP, I guess another thing to talk about, you have the two dichotomies here, because Lishan, you had an idea, you formed your own company, you own the IP, and if you could just talk about, a lot of universities have technology transfer companies and all that, is when you have an IP, it's yours, it's the university's, it's 25% yours, the rest of the university, who has that in the royalties? So if you could discuss some of those, thanks.
Sure. So an answer to the first question regarding NIH grants, we typically do not submit the NIH grants until we have actually protected it. That's one thing. But the second thing is that NIH in its application process also allows you to indicate that this is intellectual property. So when it is being reviewed by anyone on the panel, it actually remains confidential. It is not considered public disclosure. And that part of the grant would actually be removed whenever it gets funded and is released. The second thing about STTR and SBIR grants, we have done them ourselves, where we have partnered with companies that come in and work with us to develop a specific product. And that actually has helped us gain traction with companies as well, because they are looking for ideas too. And the third thing about how does the split between Emory University and the inventor really change, and I think Vinod can make a comment there, but the advantage of being at a university is that you have the resources. The disadvantage of being at a university is that you're at a university.
Yeah, it's not. Look, I mean, I'm not going to retire. I'm keeping my day job. That's all I'm saying. You know, I'm not going to be able to retire on my, you know, whatever happens to APICA, to be quite honest with you. I'm going to have to keep my day job where you know, if you're in a private equities type of system that Lishan's in, you could retire if your company does well, quite honestly.
Can I just make one quick comment? Not to
Yeah,
hog
because we really need to get Greg Jorgen.
Because I think it's important that people
involved,
understand how the money works in this, because really it comes down, most things it comes down to money. You guys have a really commendable model for getting through to design freeze, using grants, using traditional resources that you have and so forth, and that's absolutely commendable. But I think it's important for people to understand, once you have design freeze, the costs associated with the commercializing the device are heavily backloaded. So even once you have design freeze, it can be $1 million, $1.5 million just to do the grunt work of biocomp testing and all the stuff that it takes to get you through even a 510K process. And that requires external sources of capital, and that's sort of the issue that we have.
From that point, you're either going to sell it to another larger company, right? You're going to try to exit, or you're going to form your own company and try to do $5 to $6 million of grant support to do a European trial, which is where it's going to be. So let's transition. At this point, this has been a good discussion, but we need to really involve the three clinicians who are early on their platform of looking at technology, especially, you know, in Germany and in Vancouver, and then also Greg, because Greg has a lot of experience in this. So talk to us a little bit, Anson, Jorg, Greg, maybe we'll start off with you, Anson. What do you look at when a new company comes to you and say, please test this for us? When Tierra came to you, or when the Sapien valve came to you, talk to us a little bit about how you incorporate that into your practice.
Well, I think, first of all, I think you just said that I'm a little bit different. I'm not just going to want to be a hired gun. So a lot of people come talk to me.
That's why you're on the panel here. Yeah.
And I was, you know, you probably 50 company comes, maybe I'll pick one or two to work on.
Yeah.
So I think the first process is that you have to satisfy myself. First, it has to be an unmet clinical need that I think, and second is that it's going to be benefiting the patient better than what we conventionally do. So that's the two conditions. And then I look at each therapy or technology and look at that. Well, what are the criteria for me? If I design this right from the groundwork, what would I want from it? Then I evaluate that. Then I will involve myself, hopefully, very early on in the design process, then the preclinical work, and then work from there. So that is my preferred method to evaluate those devices. For give you examples, just this Tierra. That there's multiple mitral valve companies had approached me and show them their design and potential of it. And why did I pick this one? Well, actually, I approached them. They didn't approach me. So I saw in one of a few years ago on one of the AHA presentation, they showed the basic design before they very early on, and they only did a few porcine implant. So I say this satisfies my criteria for a implantable mitral valve, and that's definitely a clinical need. So I approached them. I got them early to talk to them. So I'm able to actually mold the design and actually design a lot of the preclinical work and actually perform a good portion of the preclinical work in the animal implant. And that is how I move forward into now the human implant. So I think that is my preferred way of doing it. Of course, there's other that really more established design that come to us that for us to evaluate. And those we have to go case by case basis, but it's probably not as much I prefer not to do as much of those.
You don't have as much freedom really to change.
Freedom,
design.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anton, in this early phase, do you perform any kind of risk assessment as well? And I believe from my place, at least, what helps me a lot is this kind of hard team concept to really, you get contact to a new company and you think about the positive things. You mentioned very importantly, it needs to be of benefit for patients, but new techniques are of risk for some patients as well. You mentioned your first case, who was kind of, you even used the word sacrifice, but in the end, it's risky. And I think the hard team, if all colleagues agree in a hospital, this is a good way to go, to take the risk as a team, to bring something forward for our patients, and then that's the right thing. Do you agree on that?
I agree. I mean, this cannot be the one-man show. This is a more collaborative effort with a multidisciplinary team, and that's the approach we take for majority of the innovation that we do.
So from the audience, as we go on to Jörg and Greg, please think that you have an unbelievably talented panelist here who've had a lot of experience in a variety of stuff. So we really would love for you to ask a question that's on your mind right now. So think about that a little bit more as we move to Greg and Jörg on what your thoughts about early innovation, what you've done in your own personal stuff. I know Greg has worked on some companies recently. Greg, you want to tell us a little bit about what you've done and how some of the pitfalls you've seen, or some things maybe to do or not to do, and how to get involved?
Sure. Well, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of startups, but also do consulting, upstream consulting for the usual suspects, sponsoring this meeting. And but I think it's interesting. I mean, it's a very different pathway when you're involved with a startup with an original idea and you're trying to protect that concept and develop it and mold it. And speaking to people like Lishan and others in that space to help you co-develop, because we're all busy every day at the hospital and doing what we do. And you need a team. And it's very different than when you work with industry on a large scale. And the kind of the process there is completely different. It's very exciting to be involved at the very beginning. The risk is greater. It takes more time, but in the end of the day, you're much more involved and intimate. And you and I, actually everybody on the platform here, have shared an interest in the Apex. Yeah. And so for example, when we started Entourage a few years ago, my feeling was we didn't have a platform for access and closure. And we were in an uneven playing field. And to Anton's point, unmet need, we could do better than doing thoracotomies and putting big sutures with pledgets in the apex. And so what is it? And that it evolved from, originally the IP was a very broad platform for access and closure down to, well, what's the real Achilles heel of the situation? It's just really managing the closure. And if we're going to get to a smaller and smaller incision. So, you go through lots of iterations. And the thing that I think I learned most vividly during the process, if it's involved the kinds of minds like Murali and engineers, and you tell an engineer, like, this is my problem. What I need you to do is stick the groin, go up 50 centimeters, turn left, go through a wall, turn right, and accurately deliver a device, get out of there and close all the holes that are left in the way out. And you think to yourself, oh my God, this is impossible. Well, the first thing an engineer says, well, he's already got 12 ways to solve the problem. They're not encumbered by all the challenges and obstacles that we think of during that process. So, putting together that team of people to help you raise the money, but also innovate, because there was a lot of things that you just not going to think about, whether it's materials or
you're right, absolutely right.
So it's been a great and now that's led to starting several other small companies that the same thing, same model is assembling the right combination of people, and it's stimulating, it's exciting, and if you look at the number of successes, it's kind of like opening a restaurant in Los Angeles. 9 out of 10 are closed within a year, or in New York. 9 out of 10 are closed within a year. But you learn with each step, and as long as you don't expose yourself too much financially,
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. One last thing before we move on is what's your recommendation to everybody out here? How much do you really put in financially on your own? Is that, I mean, you're at a different level. You're chief of a major program in the United States, and you may have a little bit different. But for the most average guy, is this something they should put a lot of their own money into? I mean, is that your recommendation?
No.
Absolutely.
I think the most important thing is to pass the straight face test, though, which is that if you believe in the technology and the program, I think that a personal investment is necessary. But there's just no way to expose yourself, risk your whole financial, worth. And if it's that good, there will be a lot of people like Lishan and others out there, and Manny, who's in the office. there's two Mannies out there. I'm talking
Yeah,
about Manny
he
who
is.
writes the checks, who are very interested. And if you match up your device, your idea with the right people, they're going to want to help you out. But I think that fully underwriting something beyond the very initial stages is foolhardy.
I haven't done that either, just to let you know.
But you should write a small check to.
Greg, we are talking about innovation and new developments, and you mentioned it's stimulating and exciting, and that's probably why most of you are here and why people go to such a conference. But what do you guess, how many of cardiac surgeons around the world or around this country are thinking that new techniques are stimulating and exciting and are going to implement it in the daily practice? Or how many are just sitting in the retreat position and say, okay, we do things like we did it 20 years ago, conventional surgery, and again conventional surgery, no small incisions, no new devices, don't take any risk, and what's the way forward?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that as cardiac surgeons in our community, we've evolved a lot in the last 50 years. If you think about the innovators who are set the foundations of cardiothoracic surgery in the 50s and 60s, and the risk takers, the Lillehei's and the DeBakey's, and doing stuff that they would get up on platforms, and Bailey, were losing half the patients, all the patients, but there was really no solutions for these problems. This took a certain kind of mentality to press on, and I think as cardiac surgery became more and more established and refined, we end up, instead of having incredibly brave, creative people as our leaders, we became more like jewelers. And we spent 20, 30 years, honing the craft. How do we get our mortality rate from 1.7 down to 1.6? How do we improve our cardioplegia? What other solution do we put in there? I mean, do we go from 7.0 to 8.0 suture? Are we using loops now? Are we using microscopes now? I mean, that very incremental creativity is great, and I think almost any cardiac surgeon would be interested in improving what they're doing day by day. But I think we're actually moving back into a phase now that's not dissimilar to 50 years ago, where really everything in our specialty is changing. Management of heart failure.
Hence these sessions, right? We weren't having these sessions 7 years ago.
Exactly. There's no interest in this. And I think this society obviously is a place that attracts people like that, and that's why I'm a member, where you can sit around and talk with your friends and meet regularly to kind of forge ahead. But we're going through a period, whether it's heart failure, coronary disease, structural heart disease, thoracic surgery, where a tremendous opportunity to innovate is here.
Yeah.
And
I think we are catching up.
We'd love the audience for you guys to take your small idea, the 40% of you raise your hands, and take it somewhere. That's what we really want you to do. Yeah, question.
Hey, good morning. This is an excellent discussion. I thank you guys for this. Siavash Sadat, one of the surgical residents at Rutgers, Robert Wood Johnson. We just had a recent grand rounds. It was from Jeffrey Carpenter, who's the chief of vascular down at Cooper. He came up from Camden, talked to us, and I thought 2 points were really important that he made that I was hoping you guys can talk about. One was the ease with which you can get a patent, the fact that you have an idea and where you even go. He put up the website, he put up the process, how easy it is. So if you could speak to that, everyone obviously up there has already done that before. The second point was also to get on board with engineers. If you don't have one integrated in your research lab or in your project, he spoke about conventions that meet maybe once or twice a year that you can go to and pretty much go up with an idea and meet a team of engineers, and then you sit down and brainstorm and go through that. So if anyone has experience with that process, I think it'd be really important to speak about.
So you're absolutely right.
Will you go ahead and
Yeah,
comment
just
on
some
that?
clarification on the patent side. You're absolutely right. It's $100 to file a provisional patent. You don't have to make any claims. You don't have to sort of do all the gobbledygook legalese. You just have to have pictures and basically regular narrative text as to what you're doing. That said, once you file that, that's filing a provisional patent. To actually get a patent, obviously, is an expensive process. It can require tens of thousands of dollars and many years. But hopefully, by the time those expenses are coming up,
but that's the patent application. I mean, that's the patent application. You're going to have to invest in somebody like a patent attorney.
Yeah, that's my point. Is eventually there are some significant costs associated with that. But I think it is a good point to understand. If you have an idea, you can file a provisional patent. It's $100. You can basically do it yourself, and you have 1 year to file the final of that provisional, and you can get plenty of help doing that.
So for me, and Greg, to some extent, we're in a university setting. That's all taken care of for me by Emory. Yeah. On the front end, I save. At the long end, if it goes somewhere, then I lose a little bit because somebody else did all the damn work for me.
Yep.
So, you want to
maybe just briefly need to introduce Jörg or ask him a little bit, like you presented nicely CEMEDIS versus Edwards, and just talking about new techniques, what made you think like, okay, we go for animal implants, then first in man and so on, of a new valve like CEMEDIS when we had a kind of relatively straightforward sapien valve at that time?
Yeah, actually, I think we had the luxury in Germany, and I think now the Special Access Program in Canada is a similar tool that companies will approach you if you are in a country where the regulations are not unrealistically high. So the hurdle to take for first in man is basically three options today. You can go to South America. Some companies are doing that, right? And typically Germany with a bee farm a few years ago was very attractive. I think this is why we got into contact with the new devices so early. And now it seems to be the Special Access Program in Canada that most companies go. So we were fortunate to have a lot of companies. It was not only CEMEDIS, it was Genevalve, Ventura, all these valves. And I think what I've learned from that time is that, a little bit in contrast to what Anson said, at least I try to get involved in as many projects as possible, because we have learned that you can transfer some of the techniques, some of these, the experience to the next product, so to say. So if you look at apical closures, all the devices that are under evaluation, we have touched them, and you can transfer the learnings from one to the other device. So I think this is quite important as the motivation. We've talked a little bit about money from a German perspective. At least I have not figured out how to make any money out of it. It's not so easy, I think, in a German
Or neither are we really.
Yeah, but you're trying at least. So the motivation basically is not the money. It's the interest in new technologies and the also the honor to be privileged to touch it the very first.
No, I think that, Lishan started off by saying it's an unmet clinical need. If you drive it towards the patient, that you're going to create a device that's better for a patient, everybody wins. And I think that's where you have to stick with it. It has to be an unmet clinical need. Man, you want to ask a question, and we'll close off the session.
Just a comment, I think, very gentle comment, and I was raised in the days what Walt Lillehei's lab, but I think the environment has changed. In those days where cardiac surgeons are a very strange breed. They're very courageous, very bold, but when it comes to an idea, they are not. That's because we don't have the environment which we had before. And I think in your Emory University, you have a very nice system. Early on when we started, we had biomedical engineers, Lowell Edwards. I worked with Lowell Edwards. We were just putting things in the garage. And Erbakken, for example, I worked with Erbakken. But we don't have the same atmosphere right now. I think the first fundamental stuff is to create that. The second thing you got to understand, you got to talk about the negative side. There's a lot of dead bodies out there. I think you don't go into this thinking that everything is going to be rosy.
Well, yeah, that's why Greg and I were saying don't spend a lot of your own personal fortune on this, right?
You do that when you earn a lot of money and then spend it, okay? That's different. You work hard and you earn money, and that's different. How I spend my money over the years. So I think, but there's going to be a strange breed of people who are passionate enough to carry out that idea. If you want to go to Mount Everest, there's going to be a lot of ice cliffs. So it does create a certain type of people in your community. So for you guys as leaders, you got to create that environment within amongst your young entrepreneurs. But you're not going to find everybody's going to be there. That's the way it works.
No, you're right. One place at a time. Francis?
Great. It's a great session, and I know you're coming to a close, and I just wanted to thank all the panelists for a great discussion. I think everybody learned a lot, no matter how experienced you are in the area. Sharing ideas like this, I think, is so important. I just want to remind everybody as well, we're going to have a break after this session. Then we're going to introduce new members at 10:45, and then at 11, so some of the things we've talked about, at 11 you're actually going to see a product, and in the late-breaking news session, and they're going to show you a product that was designed that I first saw in actually walking through general surgery booths. So we're going to have a late-breaking session, and we're going to see a new product that many of you probably use, and then after that we have our distinguished keynote lecturer. So again, I want to thank everybody.
On behalf of Tommy and I, thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
I've got you under my skin.